Welcome to the Sunny Future Hypothesis. In this first of a series of videos, all more or less going to be the same thing, improving everyone. So I'm just going to ramble in this first, call it a draft, and then with that learning and maybe some feedback, I'll make another one, start improving it, add some graphics, numbers, equations, everything to prove the point, or then be proven wrong by some random other person on the internet. So I'm watching you, watching me. And where to start? Problems are serious. The damages that are already done, all the species extinct, people living in poverty, suffering, all that's happening right now, and lots of the damages are irreversible. So, such as the species extinction, we're not in a situation where we can, just wait for future generations to sort it out. And there's no waiting. It's not that we can't just wait thousands of years for someone to solve our ecological problems or come up with a reason why we really shouldn't destroy the environment. It's a really present problem and pretty big, but I'm going to start with the positive solution because people don't like hearing about problems without hearing about solutions. So there is a solution to all our environmental, social problems. And it is the sun, as you may have already been told. There's plenty of energy that comes to us from the sun. Lots of the smartest scientists have pointed it out. And all the way back to Da Vinci realized we could use the sun to get energy and designed a solar concentrator. So it's been obvious for thousands of years, all the way back to Archimedes, that there's a huge potential in solar energy. And the reason why we haven't used it yet is simply it's easier if you have a store of energy, like in trees or fossil fuels. It's easier to go and chop the trees down or dig up the coal or pump out the oil and burn it than to create a direct solar economy, because it is still solar. Right? Trees are a solar device, a solar thermal device, if we're growing them to burn them, or just going to a forest and cutting them down and burning them. So we can sort of cut out the middleman and get the solar heat directly from the sun for far less cost and far less damage to the environment than trees. So in numbers, a tree is less than 0.5% efficient if we burn it. If we want heat and we're growing the tree to burn it, it's less than 0.5% efficient at converting sunlight into the heat we eventually get from burning it. And that's in good conditions. In poorer conditions, more arid conditions, non-optimum conditions, can be much less than that. And it's easy to sort of work out why. Photosynthesis is only 10% maximum efficient, doesn't happen all the time. The tree has to be happy. And with all the nutrients, then the tree uses a lot of that energy to grow. So it's not storing 100% of the energy it captures. It's got to use it to do all sorts of metabolic processes, and then cutting it down takes energy, and then burning it is not going to be 100% efficient in the burning process. So all those steps reduce efficiency from the sunlight to heat energy, and make a tree incredibly poor technology for making heat. It's of course incredibly good living organism to as the basis of the ecosystems. But for heat, it's a huge waste. It's like ecologists. I forget who, I don't know who did said it the first time, but like burning trees is for heat is like burning paintings for heat. It just has far more value than the heat energy we can extract from it. And if that was it, if that was our only choice, then if fossil fuels are depleting and causing global warming, and nuclear energy, that's another question we'll get to. But basically, bombs, when somebody sets off a bomb in a city somewhere, again, that's going to demotivate people to keep on the nuclear track. Um, so it's debatable, but what's difficult to debate now is it's too little too late anyways. There's no way to build enough nuclear reactors in the short decades we have to really solve the climate change problem. It's just not scalable, um, due to the sophistication, the engineers, the expertise, the skills. Like there's the planning, um, uh, requires huge capital investments, and then you can sit down and basic extrapolation. There's no way to build thousands of nuclear reactors in a few decades to seriously offset fossil fuel production. And then even if you do that, then there's still knock-on problems of creating all the downstream components, the electricity grids, then turning everything electric. It's a solvable problem, but again, difficult to do in a few decades. Which brings us back to solar thermal energy. A solar oven can be built locally, very few skills, very low sophistication, and get to high temperatures, hundreds of degrees, 300 degrees, 400 degrees, enough to do power basic economic activity. You can set one up with a pipe to circulate water to heat places. But I'm mostly concerned about the poor people in hot regions. And if you displace massively fossil fuel consumption in poor hot regions with solar energy, then the richer places that already have the infrastructure, and it'd be a huge, massive change to change the infrastructure. It's cheaper to run our current infrastructure, for instance, in Europe, and displace fossil fuels elsewhere, and then slowly change the infrastructure in Europe to a decentralized solar energy economy. But where people are already decentralized, are already don't have 24/7 access to energy, life is difficult, energy supplies are unpredictable, and people are already decentralized in mostly agricultural economies, then bringing in solar technology to just to displace the wood burning, which then helps regrow the forest and displace all the fossil, and especially the growth, displace all of the fossil that would be burned in conventional growth trajectory. Then you can make huge displacements as well as sequester carbon by enabling reforestation. And very cheap. There's no massive infrastructure projects needed. It's just bringing sort of standalone energy devices that then power basic agricultural transformations, basic kiln, pottery, metalworking, all the basic desalination, pasteurization, everything, all those applications can run on heat that is provided directly by the sun. And in places where people are burning wood, moving a solar device is way less labor than moving around wood, getting wood, and so on. And burning it, just like it's the same. Even once you get the wood, it's the same effort moving a solar device every 5-10 minutes than poking a fire, putting another log in. So even if you ignore the huge effort it can take to go and get wood or work to buy charcoal or other fuel, it's still less work. And I stress this point because as soon as you make a solar device automatic, the price goes up several fold. You have to make everything smooth and balanced, and plus the components, electric components and motor and so on, and it gets way more expensive and way more complicated to maintain. Whereas a fully manual solar device can just have normal bolts for all the hinges and pivot points, and there's nothing that cannot be maintainable locally, pretty much anywhere in the world. So it does require some basic metalworking, but there's metal shops in pretty much every little village or well, little town in every all over the world. So the basic welding does pretty much exist everywhere, and then the process can be scaled up. So you could make hundreds of millions of such devices all over the planet, and a huge displacement of fossil energy, and then converting these economies to fundamentally renewable economies, which then you can build more sophistication on top, such as electric production with either photovoltaic cells or windmills, or turning the heat into steam to drive turbines or other thermal motors, Stirling motors, and you create an economy for those things. And then once sophistication reaches high enough, starting at the bottom, getting to the top of essentially electric production, well, now you can take this whole technology set and bring it to richer countries to start displacing infrastructure. Because if it's just not sustainable and desirable, and growth is no longer increasing salaries and so on, and people just don't like modern Western capitalism, then on the edges, on the periphery of this system, people will realize they could import this technological system from developing world that's all solar, fully almost self-contained, and powers a comfortable and reasonable local life, and you don't have to work as a wage slave. You can, with a bit of land and energy, it's possible to live anywhere, because what is like all other problems can be reduced to energy. Water, if you have energy to pump it out of the ground or desalinate it, or capture and recycle it with purification systems, etc., right, then it's pretty much anywhere is livable. Of course, it may not be economic going into the middle of the desert, and then would require a huge amount of energy to like truck. Then your option is trucking to the sea and getting water and then desalinating it and then trucking it back to the middle of the desert. So it doesn't mean everywhere is economic, but where there is water resources and land and energy, it's possible to grow things. It's possible to live pretty decently. The question is doing it. And of course, these technologies that are local, they do not get attention in our current economy, which we're going to get to, the problems of capitalism. But to make a long story short, why it hasn't been done yet is people living locally a good life does not benefit the investor class, where you get huge profits and accumulations of capital is through dependence relationships, on centralized processes that can then be not just can, must be built by some sort of centralized organization, such as a big corporation, and that requires huge investments of capital to make. Either the processes or then the infrastructure. And that's where you get huge profits. If someone invents a better gardening technique that's simple and local, it's difficult to become a billionaire by just improving improving gardening. But if everybody had a garden and then you improved gardening, well, that would have a huge benefit to everybody. It's just it's not going to get you huge amounts of profits. So just a good, simple idea that people can do themselves, right, is not a recipe for massive profits in our economy. So these good ideas everyone can do themselves don't get attention. But if capitalism is not working, massive centralized infrastructure is not working, that this is leading to disaster, well, the alternative is local living. And once you have local living, local energy, you don't have to go and get energy. Well, now you don't need transport infrastructure. It can still be useful to have, but you don't need it. So the transport infrastructure can be scaled down and much easier to maintain and not so disruptive in catastrophes and so on, if you can continue to live without connection to large regional integrated infrastructure. So it's not that the integrated regional or global infrastructure is bad. The question is dependence. If you depend on this large infrastructure, then if it goes down, you die. And if it's not sustainable, well, you're going to die later, or your children are going to die later, and there's nothing you can do about it. But break this dependence relationship, and there's huge knock-on effects in terms of socially. Economic independence translates directly into political independence. So you have way more power. Like, let's say corporations still exist and do some things in this vision of society. Let's say, make computer chips that you can't make locally. Well, if you don't depend on them, well, now you have economic independence and thus political independence. You don't need to get their services. So rent and extractions and price gouging and manipulations of people and so on that is possible through dependence relationships suddenly are much, much harder, if not impossible, to do if people are economically economically independent. And what do you need to be economically independent at the end of the day? A source of food, shelter, and energy. And then the land for that food, energy, and shelter. Well, obviously the water, but so 4 elements. So this is totally possible. In the next videos, I'll get into sort of the math and equations of why, proving these points of why solar energy device is much, much more efficient for capturing heat than a tree. As well as these benefits of economic independence, of not needing large transportation of mass flows, because most of our energy, most of our fossil energy is put into the transport system. So this whole global integration requires huge energy inputs to create the infrastructure, maintain the infrastructure, and then move things around on this infrastructure. If people suddenly are getting most of their atoms, let's say, that they need to live locally, well, that whole infrastructure can be scaled down dramatically, and of course the energy used to power stuff on it. Doesn't mean zero infrastructure. You can still have mobility, the capacity to go somewhere, and have lower mass flows, basically. So the question is mass flows, not capabilities. Like there's a difference between being able to go to the neighboring country and exchanging millions of tons or billions of tons of goods and fuel with neighboring countries, or much less countries, not to speak of countries literally on the other side of the world. So that's kind of the first part. I like to think of it as the complexity ladder. So the first step is building really basic agricultural transformation technologies, baking, roasting are the big ones, and dehydration. So those are sort of the trivium of agricultural technologies. Then from there, you can get into kilns, desalination, pasteurization, cooling processes, not necessarily freezing, but cooling with basic heat to cool technologies. Then from there, basic metalworking, for instance, aluminum. Once you have aluminum, it melts pretty easily, so reworking aluminum into different things, and then increase temperature even more. You can start to get steam, have steam engines for processing. Basic reciprocating steam engine can have a big, maybe less efficient for electric production, but can have a huge advantage in being able to take variable loads in crushing or grinding processes. As well as you can always, recycling waste heat, can increase the efficiency that way. And then ultimately electricity. It's not that electricity is bad. I'm using it right now, but you don't die quickly if electricity cuts off. But if it's winter and there's no food and there's no heating, people are going to die pretty quickly. Likewise, if you suddenly can't cook your food, you're going to die relatively quickly. Whereas simply going without electricity can be inconvenient. Maybe you can't work, but that's not a direct cause of you're going to die. So this decentralized solar thermal system that's very simple, very easy to maintain. Everything, there's no regional integration because it's not efficient to transport heat over long distances. So if you have solar thermal devices, they to power directly applications, then they're all local and independent of each other. So they can be repaired locally, and there's the whole infrastructure can't go down due to single point failures of transformers failing or power lines falling and so on. So it's a very resilient system. If all of the processes you really need to live, all heating, cooking, and agricultural processes and water processes are all powered by this solar thermal technology. That's simple and easy to maintain. Of course, that's sort of the benefits, and then how to get there is the economic question, making it cheap enough to outcompete other ways of doing things, in particular fossil fuels and charcoal, burning wood, even with the subsidies these current practices get and the cultural momentum. So the hypothesis part is that it's possible to break the cost barriers and sort of beat capitalism at its own game by creating a sustainable, clean energy process that is simply cheaper and therefore just takes over the world based on just current institutional and social conditions. Because it's this climate change problem is too now imminent to say, okay, we're going to change the political system, we're going to change all our institutions, and then we're going to come back and solve this problem. So we have to somehow solve the problem in the institutional setup we have. If the institutions do something positive, great, but so far they've proven that ineffective and mostly just so far have just focused on non-solutions like biofuels and so on for propaganda purposes and not accomplishing anything real purposes. So that's the solution. Of course, it then combines with like lots of the other like lots, if not all, the other ecological deep ecology practices like permaculture and local construction. But it's the way to think about it is it's sort of the keystone. Once you have cheap enough energy locally to drive economic processes, well, now there's a reason to be there, sort of like labor follows energy around. It's not really the other way around. You first need a source of energy, then that powers processes, and people, labor, then come to manage these processes, right? That's why you have factory towns. There was some energy either already there or then brought there to do some process like extracting minerals or whatever, a mine, ultimately, which then is used to keep the whole fossil infrastructure going. So if you have local solar energy that can produce basic agricultural and then other sort of cottage industry things, spin process and spin fibers or even make paper and so on, and these can be exchanged with the outside world because you're going to always need some sort of foreign exchange to buy some inputs, so you still have the question of what is going to be sold still needs to be solved, and that's going to take energy. But then once you have those economic outputs, well, now that justifies more and more and more people being in this local situation, which is a true sort of going back to the earth, because currently, if all you're selling is food and there's no value added, then that doesn't maintain many people. So you can have a big organic farm, but very few people actually living on it, because there's no energy for material transformations to add value to the local resources. And then, of course, the more this is done, right, then the more you're exchanging with economic units that are not so far away. So at first, right, these products would just go into the global supply chain, and if the energy is cheap enough, then they can compete with fossil-derived products. But then as more and more of these local economies are created that have outputs, then you start trading more and more with just people who do different things but aren't that far away, again reducing the transportation energy costs, increasing resilience of local systems, and then ultimately global resilience. So I have answered the first two questions on this talk. Actually, the third question as well. Maybe now's the time to make a little pause, and then I'll start with the negatives.